A very warm welcome to all of you in this 12-week NPTEL course titled Migration, Mobility and Development. My name is Amrita Datta and I teach Development Studies at the Department of Liberal Arts at IIT Hyderabad. I've also been working on the topic of migration for nearly 15 years. It is my pleasure to introduce you to this course that I have developed, and in this first class, I will take you through how the course is organized, what it contains and what you can expect from it. Right, so as you know from the course outline, this course aims to engage with contemporary scholarship in migration studies. And we will do so by critically studying key concepts, theories of migration, and we will interrogate the relationship between migration and development. And we will also draw on a multidisciplinary theoretical and empirical literature in the social sciences. So, the course focuses on the social, economic and cultural drivers of migration as well as its consequences for individuals, families and societies in both host and destination regions, particularly in the context of globalization. And in the course, we also re-examine the divide between internal and international migration. And lastly, the course will consider the scope and limitation of migration policies in an increasingly mobile and connected world. So, the course, as you know, is divided in 12 weeks and there are 42 lectures or 42 lessons, including this introductory lecture. The first 4 weeks of the course are devoted to theory and concepts in migration, and then bit by bit we will move on to empirics and policy. Now, before I break it down a little more and give you a week-wise outline of lectures, let me come to the question of who this course is intended for. The course, its syllabus and reading list is structured in such a way that the course will be helpful for someone with an interest in the topic and looking to learn more, as well as for specialized students at the PhD and master's level. So, therefore, the course is intended for students at all levels, whether it's bachelor's, master's or PhD, and it's also relevant for migration and development researchers, migration practitioners, people in development organizations, the CSR sector, policy think tanks, etc. Now, the way we would like to approach the course is this. In each lecture, a particular topic will be introduced, and in that sense the lecture is an end in itself. And at the end of each lecture there will be a reading list, typically a couple of references. Engaging with these will help you understand and study the topic in depth. So, depending on the level that you're at and your interest in a particular topic, you can decide how much to go in depth into particular readings. For the purpose of the exam, a majority of the questions will be covered from the class lectures. I am also very excited to share with you that we have several guest lectures from experts in specific areas of climate change and migration, migration and livelihoods, gender and migration, skill migration, student migration, migration and refugees, among others. So, you will have the good fortune of learning from excellent researchers, some of whom have spend their lives working on these specific issues in migration studies. Having said that, let me now take you through a week-wise outline of the course. In the first week, which is this week, the first class, which is this class, introduces you to the course. After this class, in the second class on disciplinary considerations in migration studies, we will do two things. First, for much of that class, we will broadly look at how migration is studied and understood through the lens of various disciplines. We will focus on the disciplines of anthropology, demography, economics, geography, history, law, political science and sociology. Now, for this, the primary reference is the first chapter of the seminal book, Talking Across Disciplines, Migration Theory Talking Across Disciplines by Caroline Britell and James Holyfield. And the second thing that we will do in the second class would be that we will talk very briefly about the implications that different disciplines might have for public policy. So, for this I will show you how evidence-based policy for the same migration can be radically different from the lenses of different disciplines. And then I hope this will help us critically think about evidence-based policy as we move along in the course. In the third class of the week, titled Theoretical Foundation in Migration Studies, we will cover two seminal theorists, Ernst Georg Ravenstein, who formulated the very first laws of migration, published in 1885 and 1889, and then we will move on to Everett Lee's 1966 paper on the theory of migration, which builds on Ravenstein's work. These laws and theories of migration are the theoretical and conceptual building block of migration studies, and both theoretical and empirical researchers continue to refer to Ravenstein's laws of migration, and Lee's work is understood to be very important, the foundation of the push and pull framework in migration. In the fourth class of the week, we will study a very influential economic theory in migration studies, which is the neoclassical economic theory. We will focus on micro and macro perspectives for migration theory. We will focus on the neoclassical equilibrium perspective, and then we will also discuss the limitations of neoclassical equilibrium perspectives and its implications for policy. In the second week, we continue with our theories on migration. In the first lecture of the second week, we will cover the new economics of labor migration, also known as NELM, where the unit of analysis moves from an atomized individual to a dynamic household as we move from neoclassical theory to NELM, and migration is seen as an income enhancing and risk sharing livelihood strategy that's adopted by the household. And this NELM is developed by Oded Stark and his colleagues, who conceptualize it to incorporate remittances, circular migration, return migration in its framework, and all of these until so far had been beyond the scope of neoclassical theorization. Then we move on to our class on transitional theories of migration in the second lecture of this week, and transitional theory of migration largely is anchored in Zelinsky's work. So, we are going to be looking at demographic transition and mobility transition. We are specifically going to look at development and mobility transition. How is it that development, or what Zelinsky calls vital transition, affects mobility transition? And then within this context, we are going to look at the migration hump, and we will also look at the limitations of transitional migration theories. The third class in this week is going to look at systems theory. Systems theory has been conceptualized by the Nigerian geographer Akin Mabugunje. It's seminal work by Akin Mabugunje, and I will also use other papers to help explain this to you. I will take you through parts of Mabugunje's paper, and I encourage you to read the paper. System theory is fundamentally different from the theories that we would have looked so far in the course. Transitional theories, neoclassical theories, the new economics of labor migration. System theory is different from all of these, and as the name suggests, systems theory is broader, it's wide-ranging. It also tells us about the links between migration and development. And in the fourth class, we are going to look at migration networks and network theory in migration studies. This is largely focusing on the importance of social networks. Here we will look at Massey and his colleagues' seminal paper covering international migration, which is a very important paper that we will use in the course of several lectures. Other paper that we are going to be using in the course of this course is Hein de Haas's 2008 working paper, which was published by the International Migration Institute at Oxford University, and much of our course will be anchored, especially the theoretical component, in these two papers. Let us come to the third week now. We continue with migration theories in the third week. And in the first lecture, we look at migration infrastructure and migration industry. Now, these are relatively new concepts in migration studies, and there are new ways of seeing and thinking about migration. Now, the concept of migration infrastructure largely comes from empirics, and there is a paper by Xiang and Lindquist that looks at low-skilled international migration from China and Indonesia, and they argue that the theoretical framework, that the current theoretical framework is not adequate to understand many facets of low-skilled international migration. So, this is very relevant for our country as well, where we have low-skilled international migration to the Gulf countries and many other parts of the world. So, they focus on migration infrastructure, and they argue that migration infrastructure has developed, and through the lens of two empirical case studies, they develop the concept of migration infrastructure, and we will do this in depth. The second part of this lecture looks at migration industry, and it looks at the role of migration industry at not only facilitating migration, but also migration management. And therefore, it also focuses on the increasing role of non-state actors in migration, specifically international migration. The second lecture in the third week is a very important lecture, and we're going to look at Stephen Castle's paper, Understanding Global Migration, a Social Transformation Perspective. So here, Castle discusses why it is so difficult to theorize in migration studies, right? Why is it that theory formation is so difficult in migration studies? And this is something that we're going to cover across the course, but this is the key reading for that. And then eventually Stephen Castle argues that a general theory of migration is neither possible nor desirable. And then what we really need to do, what according to Castles and many other theorists, is that we need to re-embed migration research in a more contemporary, in a more general understanding of society, and we need to link migration to broader theories of social change. So, now see, this is really important because very often, several studies take a stand that migration and development are two different things, and migration and development need to be studied separately, which is the impact of one needs to be studied on the other. On the other hand, what Castle is arguing is that no, we need to link migration to broader theories of social change, and because migration is only one part of social change, and this needs to be done across a range of social scientific disciplines, right? And the third and fourth lecture in this week discuss the migration and development discourse. And so we'll take off right from Stephen Castle, where Castle talks about the fact that migration needs to be seen as a part of broader processes of social change, and Castle says that you cannot disentangle migration from development. Now, the migration and development discourse, or which is the mainstream migration and development literature, is somewhat different. As you can see, migration and development are seen as two different, separate, mutually exclusive categories, and this literature is largely focused on studying the impact of migration on development. So, you can see that this is quite different conceptually and analytically from what Castle argues and from what many other scholars argue, that migration cannot be separated from development, that migration is a part and parcel of the development process. However, in the migration and development paradigm that we are going to discuss in detail in the third and fourth lectures in week 3, we treat migration and development as two distinct categories, as variables in many empirical projects, and it's mostly economists who go on to study the relationship between the two. And so, in this they could study what is the impact of migration on development, what is the impact of development on migration. So, conceptually and analytically, in the migration and development discourse, there is this idea, or we can say there is a very strong assumption that migration and development are mutually exclusive, and it is possible to examine the relationship and even the causality of one with the other. Again, I want to emphasize how looking at migration and development in this way is fundamentally different from looking at migration and development in the social transformation approach. And we will also look at the paradoxes of migration and development, and specifically focusing on how development doesn't halt or reduce migration. Actually, it increases migration, and this has some very, very practical and important policy implications. In this, we will also look at the inability of push and pull models or neoclassical models to explain migration. And then we will focus on migration's potential to affect structural change, which is actually quite limited. We will also look at the migration and development nexus, and we will look at migration and development from the lens of critical development studies. In the next week, we will move on to structure and agency in migration studies. So, in social sciences, there's a complex relationship between structure and agency, which has persisted for decades, and this debate keeps coming up, continues to be relevant. The relationship between the micro and macro and the individual and society, and even more important in migration research is that we rely very much on the agency of individual migrants and vis-a-vis the structures in which they are located, and we also rely on the agency of non-migrants. So, we rely on the agency of migrants and non-migrants to understand broader processes of social change. So, the first lecture will focus on structure and agency in migration studies. In the second lecture, we will move to the aspirations turn in migration studies, and this is largely drawing on Jürgen Carling's work, and here we are specifically going to look at aspiration, desire, and the social grounding of aspiration and desire. What is the context? What is the social and structural context within which aspirations are located, right? So, aspirations are not only a function of individual agency, but they are also a function of the structures and in which individuals are located. Then we are going to look at Carling's idea of aspirations and involuntary mobility. We look at the aspirations and capability framework, and so again these are all relatively new concepts and theories in migration studies and aspirations. In the third lecture, we will look at how migration is theorized in anthropology. So, here again we'll use the seminal book Talking Across Disciplines, Migration Theory Talking Across Disciplines, and we'll look at Caroline Britell's chapter on theorizing migration in anthropology. The last lecture of this week is focused on units of analysis and methodological nationalism. And fundamentally, we're going to spend some time talking about what are the various units of analysis in social research and in migration studies, and what are the implications of using these units of analysis, right? And so, we'll talk a little bit about the research process, how research might be done, what the implication of each unit. So, for instance, you can have the individual, you can have households, you can have communities, you can have the nation, country, nation state and the world. So, you have various units of analysis that can exist, and we will unpack these a little more. And then we will also study the concepts of methodological nationalism and methodological individualism, which are two ends of a spectrum. In the fifth week, we will study transnationalism in migration studies. So, in the early 1990s, there was a transnational turn in migration studies. What do we mean by the transnational turn? Scholars realized that international migration extended beyond the boundaries of the nation state. So, therefore, migrants maintain various kinds of ties to their homeland, and at the same time they are incorporated in countries that receive them. So, increasingly social life takes place across borders, even as the political and cultural importance of nation states and boundaries remains strong. So, transnational migration studies is inherently an interdisciplinary field, and scholars across the world are seeking to analyze, seeking to describe these dynamics, and also develop new methodological tools with which they can do so. So, we are going to look at Peggy Levitt and Nadia Jaworski's seminal paper on transnationalism. And so, the first thing that we will do here is, based on the paper, we will see different ways in which scholars have defined and approached transnational migration. Then we look at it from the lens of discipline. How is it that migrant transnationalism is seen in different disciplines such as economics, politics, the social, the culture, and even different arenas like the religious. And then finally, we will discuss methodological implications of transnationalism for the study of international migration. The third class of this week is a guest lecture by Dr. Amal Latif at SRM University. The lecture is titled Being a Kadama, Narratives from the Peripheries of Mobility from Malayali Women Domestic Workers in the Gulf. So, Dr. Latif's lecture is based on her doctoral work, which is a multi-sited ethnography, and this is an example of empirical research in transnational migration studies. So, students who are looking to execute their own research, this will be very helpful for them, because Dr. Latif also discusses her research process extensively and very generously in this lecture. The sixth week is devoted to gender in migration studies. Now, in this course, gender is something which is cross-cutting. We do look at gender across various weeks, but in the sixth week, gender is studied in a standalone manner. So, there are two broad papers, one is Lutz's paper and the other is Mahler and Pesser's paper, and broadly we will use this to understand the scholarship on gender in migration studies. So, we will start with why is it for so long women have been absent, there is an invisibility of women in migration studies, why is it that gender matters, what are the stages of women and gender research in migration. We will talk a little bit about the feminization of migration. We will talk about work, employment, gendered labor markets. Then we will talk about the impact of migration on female migrants and left behind women. And specifically, we are going to talk about the various levels of analysis, various spatial scales. We will focus a little more on the research methods, what the role of ethnographers is in gender in migration, looking at Mahler and Pesser's work, and then we will see how gender shapes migrant households, kinship, social networks, and that children are also gendered. And we are going to look at nation states, we are going to look at supranational institutions, and we will also study the concept of gender geographies of power, which is introduced by Mahler and Pesser. And lastly, we look at two cases of state-induced migration. One is the Bracero program in the US, and the second is the case of Filipino migration. So, we will look at these cases of state-induced migration. What is the role of the state in gendered migration in a little more detail. The third lecture in this week is a guest lecture. It's a very, very comprehensive guest lecture on theories and concepts in migration by Professor Nitha N. at the Center for Women's Development Studies. So, Professor Nitha will take us through various theories and concepts in migration, and then she takes us through her own empirical work at CWDS on female migration. And here she will look specifically at the various types of labor migration, the patterns of migration, what is the migration process in terms of inclusion and exclusion. She will talk about questions of autonomy in migration, and she also looks at the criminalization of women's migration with respect to anti-trafficking laws. In the seventh week, we continue with concepts and we also come to empirics and policy. So, the first lecture is on migration and human rights. Broadly, there are two parts of this lecture. First, we will talk about what is it that we mean by human rights. So here we'll go back to the foundation, spend some time talking about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then look at the UN Sustainable Development Agenda with a focus on migrants as human rights to understand the global architecture for human rights today, specifically with reference to migration and migrants. And then in the lecture on migration and human rights, we'll spend some time discussing that if we have such a progressive framework, such a progressive global framework for human rights, why is it that the empirics of migrant rights are in such dire straits? So for this, we're going to draw on Raul Delgado Wise's work on structural aspects of contemporary migration embedded in neoliberal economic development, to understand the tensions in the migration and development discourse and the migrant and human rights discourse. And so then, here then we take a view, we take a perspective, and we conclude our work on migration and human rights by arguing that there's a need to reframe the debate on migration, development and human rights in a post-neoliberal world. The second lecture in this week is by Dr. Mukta Nayak, and so what Dr. Nayak does is she focuses on who is the undeserved when it comes to migrant housing, why is it that rentals are crucial for migrants. Then she discusses rentals in India across city size, she discusses where labour migrants live, what is the kind of housing, what has been the rental policy of the state over time, and what is holding back rental housing. And eventually she argues that housing is a very important foothold for migrants and discusses some ideas on what can be done to boost rental housing. In the third lecture of this week, we have Dr. Chandni Singh from the Indian Institute of Human Settlements giving a talk on migration in the context of climate change. So now this is again a very important topic. Dr. Singh argues that in the area of climate change, she discusses both risk and adaptation, and in climate migration, she takes us through various global arguments and local realities of climate and migration. And more specifically, she draws on her own empirical work and also gives us some policy pointers. In the 8th week, we discuss circular migration and livelihoods. Now, circular migration is really important in the context of NELM or the new economics of labour migration, or in the context of internal migration, or in the context of international migration. So, in the first paper, we have Dr. Kunal Keshri from the International Institute of Population Sciences. He takes us through data, measurement and definitional issues specifically related to temporary labour migration versus permanent migration. He focuses on the NSS data, the PLFS data and the IHDS data, and he also takes us through his empirical work in Jharkhand. So what he is really doing is that he is talking about temporary labour circulation in India. In the next lecture, Dr. Saundarya Iyer from RV University introduces us to the concept of localized urbanization in rural India. So this is really a case of studying circular migration, migration from a village in Karnataka. So from the lens of a village study, through our own empirical work, Dr. Iyer conceptualizes localized urbanization, which is the kind of urbanization, she argues, in the rural, which is dependent on migration. And so this theorization then has implications for the dispersed nature of urbanization in India. In the last lecture in this week, Dr. Chetan Choithani from the National Institute of Advanced Studies takes us through his empirical work on migration and livelihoods. The very recent paper published in the World Development, drawing on empirical work in Bihar and West Bengal, and it asks questions such as, what is the role of migration in present day livelihood strategies of household? And second, what are the ramifications for the well-being of the involved population? So largely, work in this week focuses on circular migration, and through empirical work, through research projects which researchers have done, experts have done in these areas, and also looking at existing data sources such as PLFS, such as the NSS and IHDS. So broadly, this week will take you through not only the theories, the concepts, empirics, but also the research process. How is it that these researchers have done this migration? They do share this very generously with us. So again, for people who are looking to do their own research project, this is going to be a very important week. In the 9th week, we continue with the empirics of migration. The first lecture is on Kerala Migration Surveys by Professor Irudya Rajan at the International Institute of Migration and Development. And the Kerala Migration Surveys, as some of you might know, is a pioneering study, and it's a periodic study. It happens every 5 years, which is led by Professor Irudya Rajan. So the first study was undertaken in 1998, and roughly every 5 years we've had studies. So in 2023, we had the 7th round of the Kerala Migration Survey, and these surveys really provide crucial data on emigration, on remittances and return migration, and also more recently they've been focusing on student migration, female migration, changing destinations of Kerala migrants, what is the role of remittances. So they give us a very, very broad ranging longitudinal perspective on outmigration from Kerala, what its patterns have been, what are the changes, and so on. In the second lecture, again using NSS data, we have Professor Jajati Parida from the University of Hyderabad, who will take us through the migration scenario in Orissa. So what are the characteristics of migration in Orissa? How have they changed over time? This is something that we will see from the lens of secondary data, which is NSS data. And in the third lecture, I will take you through my own work on Bihar migration. We look at what Bihar's experience has been with respect to migration based on a source area study. The 10th week focuses on internal migration in India, patterns, political economy and policy. In the first lecture, Professor Deepak Mishra will take us through a political economy perspective of internal migration in contemporary India. So, what Professor Mishra does is he takes us through various patterns of migration, and then he argues that the political economy of circular migration in India is fundamentally related to the uneven economic development in our country, agrarian change, the informal economy and social reproduction. He also focuses on the role of the state in understanding political economy of migration in contemporary India. The second lecture is a guest lecture by Dr. Binoy Peter at the Center for Migration and Inclusive Development, and Dr. Peter's presentation brings forward fundamental empirical and policy issues in migration. He, for instance, discusses who are the migrants, why do they migrate, what is the relationship between the rural and urban, between agriculture and migration? Why is it that migrants are exploited in the city? What can be done about it? How is it that migrants can lead to dignified lives in the city? These are some of the issues that Dr. Peter will discuss in his talk. In the third lecture this week, I will talk about circular migration a little more, and we will interrogate the concept of circular migration. The idea is to better understand the concept of circularity in migration or circular migration, which would have come up significantly by now in the course. And so what I'll discuss is that circularity is typically used in the international migration literature. So I will take you through how this has changed over time. And it is not really conceptualized in the Indian context, and we will do that. And the key motivation to do this is really empirical, right? Much of the migration in India is circular, which is and not only is it circular, but it's also masculinized. So, which is men go out to work and then they come back to the village, and this has been going on for a very long time. And so, the whole idea that people go work for much of their working lives in the city and come back to the village. There are various reasons for this. We'll discuss some of this in detail, and the idea really is to have the empirics of migration contribute to the idea, to the conversation about its conceptualization. In the 11th week, we continue with concepts, empirics and policy. The first lecture is by Dr. Adra Surendran from the Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad, and this is largely on construction workers, on migrant construction workers. So, Dr. Surendran discusses the role of long distance migration in labor supply and its influence on labor process within the construction industry in India. And in doing this, then she discusses the modalities of surplus extraction by different actors in the value chain, and she discusses how labor is recruited, how labor is mobilized, and in doing this, there is an entanglement of formal and informal labor relations and mode of organizational control. The second and third lecture in the 11th week are devoted to the emotions and the social cost of migration. So, in looking at emotions in migration research, we look at a small body of literature that is important, and it's also less studied. And though in recent years this is changing, emotions is an emerging field in migration research, and it's critical that we study emotions not only in their own right, but also to better understand the various facets of migration that we study in the course. And then we move on to another lecture on the social costs of migration. Now, this is a broader literature, and the social costs of migration are wide-ranging, closely connected to the processes of migration, the impacts of migration. So, we are going to look at social costs of migration on those left behind, but also on migrants themselves. And here, I would like to privilege the institutional and structural understanding of the social cost of migration, because much of the social cost of migration have to do with border rules, visa norms, how work is organized in a capitalist society, and all of these issues have less to do with migrants themselves, but more to do with broader national and global structures and systems in which they operate. The last lecture of this week is a very important lecture on migration policy. This is going to be delivered by Mr. Varun Agarwal from India Migration Now, and this discusses critical policy issues related to internal migration in India, and it discusses the conceptualization and execution of IMPEX, which is the Internal Migration Policy Index. And in the last week, we continue with concepts, empirics and policy. The first lecture is going to be delivered by Professor Iridya Rajan and on international student migration. And Professor Rajan argues in this lecture that international student migration is closely intertwined with demographic change. This lecture is very empirically grounded. Professor Rajan will take us through the growth of a new middle class, aspirations of parents and children that explain this surge in international student migration, while at the same time, the student migration, he argues, can be explained by inequalities in educational infrastructures. And then he also discusses the need for support systems, psychological support, reintegration policies for return student migration. And he also focuses on how student migrants actually work in a shadow labor market, and they are therefore undocumented migrants in many contexts. In the next lecture in this week, Professor Binod Khadaria, retired professor from the Jawaharlal Nehru University, specifically focuses on highly skilled migrants from India in a global context. And both the talk on student migration as well as the talk on skill migration talks about reverse remittances. So, we have the concept of remittances that we're going to study in the course of the course, but this talks about reverse remittances. In the third lecture of this week, Professor Priyanka Mathur from Jain University will deliver a talk on refugees, migrants and the nation state, the insider-outsider paradox. Here, Professor Mathur is going to look at the various concepts and definitions of refugees and migrants, and she will also share her own empirical work on Rohingya migrants in Delhi, and therefore discuss concepts of the state and statelessness and so on. And with that, we will come to the end of the course, and there will be a final lecture which concludes the course. And this is just to give you a brief overview of how your 12 weeks are going to go, what this course is going to look like in the 42 lectures in the 12 weeks. And of course, this is just a very small glimpse, and I hope that there will be topics, several topics that will be of interest to you and that you will find these useful. The other thing I want to emphasize is that through the course, as we do various concepts, as we do various theories and empirics and policy, we are going to have a deep focus on the research process, and many lectures would look at the research problem, and many researchers, many guest lecturers, in many lectures I will unpack also how we have done research, so that not only do you develop an understanding of concepts and theories in migration, but also you have some sense, some idea of the research process in migration studies. So therefore, if you're building your own projects, you're thinking about your own projects, this course will be helpful. Now let me introduce you to the three very dynamic teaching assistants for the course. The first teaching assistant is Pranita Kulkarni. Pranita's research focuses on migration and labor. She has a background in development studies, and she's also interested in gender, intersectionality, social movements and unionization. The second TA for the course is Faheen Faraz. Faheen is a third-year PhD scholar in development studies at the Department of Liberal Arts at the Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad. With basic training in economics, Faheen has a strong interest in development economics, labor and political economy. His doctoral work focuses on the work, employment and livelihoods of platform-based gig workers. And the third TA of the course is Anand Raj. Anand Raj is a research scholar at the Department of Liberal Arts in the Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad. His areas of interest are platform-based gig work, political economy, labor, migration and urban studies. Anand has completed his Masters in Political Science from the University of Delhi and was an urban fellow at the IIHS. He's also worked at the Azim Premji University and the V.V. Giri Institute of Labor. So these are your three very dynamic TAs for the course, and you're going to be spending some time with them in all your assignments and largely through the course of the next 12 weeks. All right, thank you very much, and together we look forward to delivering the course to you.